I personally feel horribly let down by my school.
Even if I was just a smidgen more prepared, that the institution I was talking to might not have my best interests at heart.
Yeah. I went through a criminal trial when I was 15 years old. You went through a criminal trial as well.
I was a bit older though.
Please never say whichever again.
Welcome to Secrets Worth Sharing, a series all about having more supportive conversations around child sexual abuse. This particular episode is about the role of institutions in child sexual abuse. I'm Sophia, a designer and also a survivor of child sexual abuse, and I'm joined by my friend Wren. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I will. First, I'm going to introduce this guy because he keeps interrupting us. This is Buddy.
As an emotional support animal, Buddy's been here for you, absolutely.
Yeah.
It just also might mean there's ever so slightly a couple of changes in sound or video quality and stuff like that.
Yeah, or just a random tale.
Yeah, but now you can work with it.
I'm Wren. I am a survivor of child sex abuse. I'm also a lawyer and have worked a lot supporting vulnerable people. I also run and founded a charity supporting adult survivors of child sex abuse.
We work together.
Yeah, we met at work.
Yeah. We've known each other for about a year now.
Yeah, it
longer.
Feels longer. Yeah, definitely.
I remember really vividly because one of the first times I met you, I just disclosed to the whole team.
You did.
We were working a lot on diversity and especially communities that have been minoritized, and a huge part of that is looking at trusting authority and trusting government.
Yeah.
I was really determined to build a workplace culture that felt genuine.
Safe, yeah.
And safe, yeah. And then I just said, look, I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse. I've had a lot of mistrust in different services because of it. I say that because it helps me to understand how some people have a distrust of healthcare.
It's interesting that we're talking about institutions because I instantly felt very fearful for you. My experience of the role in institutions in protecting individuals who have experienced abuse has not always been very positive. I felt very worried about you, and I worried that that could be weaponized against you in a workplace, which is really tragic that that's something that we have to worry about in this day and age, but I did. I think sometimes when we think about child sex abuse, we think about the weight on the NHS, for example, as a long-term consequence, but actually the impact of it on the workforce is huge. There's been an estimate that those whose abuse commenced or was carrying on in 2019, the cost to society will be around 10 billion. And a lot of that is not what you'd think. It's long-term health issues that aren't related to mental health, time off work from employment. The way it manifests itself is very, very wide-ranging. And you don't just have that divide where you leave the consequences at home. And even if you try to, there might be occasions when it comes up at work.
We've both had some sort of experience with the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, which we're going to start referring to as ISCA.
Yeah, so ICSA was set up, I think it was in 2015. It was when Theresa May was still Home Secretary, and it came off the back of Jimmy Savile. And it was decided to give it a statutory footing, which meant that the inquiry could compel evidence and compel witnesses. It concluded in October, I think, of 2022. Something like 3 million pages of evidence. It was a phenomenal thing, huge. And as part of its setup, there was the Truth Project, which I think you were involved in, hearing the stories of survivors. And they've come up with a bunch of recommendations, I think 22. And a lot of it is looking at the role of institutions in child and sex abuse, and they've made various recommendations around that. Some of the key common themes were that response organisations cared more about their reputations. They were actively involved in cover-ups again and again and again. Children weren't believed, children weren't listened to. And I'm conflicted because I think all progress is good progress, and that we're finally being listened to. I also don't think it should take millions of pounds and 8 years to come to the conclusion that children aren't really listened to. So although I'm very glad of the recommendations, I don't think they go far enough.
My biggest fear with a lot of the the reports didn't tell me anything particularly new, if I'm honest, but I was impressed with how they collated the information. Yeah. But my biggest fear is it's you have these reports, honestly, so many of them.
Yeah.
In so many different spaces.
We've seen that in healthcare as well. We've seen all sorts of inquiries, recommendations to make things safer. Is it safer? Even since it started, we've had the Me Too movement. Everyone's invited. We're at a very different societal shift, I think.
Yeah.
But still, I share your concerns wholeheartedly.
The mean age of people who took part in the Truth Project were 50.
Yeah.
And to think and for a lot of them, it was the first time they told anyone about what they'd gone through. Institutions, by repeating these mistakes, just only delay the prolonging that people can come out about it, right?
Yeah. What I was glad for is that even in the executive summary, I think the report highlights that the physical and emotional mental health impacts, the lifelong impacts to relationships and work, in most cases are pretty bad. In some cases, they're unsurvivable. People do not always come back from this. Like it's killing people, and it doesn't just ruin one person's life. So I am glad that we have evidence now. I think it's a lot harder for people to say this isn't happening or this isn't a problem. And I do think we're starting to see a shift. But yeah, I don't think the recommendations go far enough. And even if they did, we don't know if they're going to be enacted as legislation.
So we talked about ICSA writing all these recommendations.
Yeah.
You know that for love no money, I'm not the best reader. Could you just provide a bit of a summary for us about what some of those recommendations were?
The report recommends that people have a legal duty to report abuse to authorities. So, for example, if I went through what I did with my school today, they would have had a legal obligation to tell the police. Now, the finding is very nuanced, so the disclosure has to be from the child, which is problematic. It's just caveated in all sorts of very problematic ways. But it would bring the UK up to kind of international norms. A lot of countries have mandatory reporting. It's kind of weird that we don't.
I'd love to ask you a bit more about this because I'm in two minds so much about this particular question. When I was at school, we then did a voluntary thing where we looked after some children in care groups and took them on different trips and stuff. And as part of the safeguarding training, they were talking about, not necessarily child sexual abuse, but what happens if a child tells you something that puts them in harm. The training at the time for us was very much, if a child is about to tell you something and you suspect that it's going to be that they're going to tell you about abuse, before they even get to telling you, you have to say, I'm going to stop you there. If you name any specific names, I have to take that to the police. And that question actually happened to me when I was emailing the NSPCC.
Yeah.
Not to slant on them, I think some of the work they do is really good, but I remember with my fake email address, emailing the NSPCC. Olivia emailed the NSPCC, literally though. And then they replied and was like, yeah, before you tell us anything else, if you name the person who abused you, we're going to report it straight away. And then I just logged off, shut the computer, logged it, wiped off my history and was like, I hope they never find me. And that was all I took away from the conversation.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And that is one of the debates in favour of not having mandatory disclosure, is what if it puts children off from coming forwards. So the research that's been done suggests that 88% of survivors are in favour, because they have this already in Australia, for example, that it doesn't put people off coming forwards at all. And what it does instead is eases some of the guilt of the person that's being confided in about whether they should disclose to the police or so on and so forth. It's aimed at churches, sports clubs, schools. The duty wouldn't fall on random members of the public, for example. And actually, again, more of the recommendations look into the various ways we pick up on abuse. And there should be so much less obligation on the child to come forwards and so much more information about what to look out for instead. I personally feel horribly let down by my school, catastrophically down by them, which is sometimes a cause for debate because my abusers weren't employed by my school, they weren't teachers, but I personally felt like they willfully turned a blind eye and failed to protect me massively. But to the extent that I ended up bringing legal action against my school as an adult. And one of the things that really struck me in that is I approached a few law firms. I'm a lawyer, I have a good idea of the kind of firms that could help in this. Not a single one would touch the case because they thought the chance of success was so slim because there is no legal duty for mandatory reporting involving the police or social services. That doesn't exist. So I ended up doing the case single-handedly on my own. I felt the neglect was so compelling It's easy for outsiders to say, oh, were the signs really there? I don't think they were. And that's indeed what my school said to me. They said, you're misremembering. We'd do the same if it happened again today.
Oh God, that's not what you want to hear, is it?
No, I could not believe it. Some of the things that happened to me, for example, was I was often taken out of lessons by my abuser. I became pregnant when I was about 13 years old, and the school nurse regularly prescribed me the morning after pill. She was aware of my termination, as well obviously the healthcare services that I was forced to have. I frequently self-harmed, I often had bruising. I displayed, I think, pretty much every single symptom of childhood sex abuse. And on top of that, I myself disclosed and shared text messages from my abuser with teachers. My friends' parents came in and raised concerns about what was happening to me. And no reports to social services or the police were made. My abuser actually wrote a letter to the school saying that I'd been telling lies and that I needed to move tutor groups. And the battle to get that information from them was immense. I mean, I could not have done it without legal training. I had to take them to the Information Commissioner to get my own records. I think there was a time where I missed over a third of the school year in one. You know, they didn't see any of the signs they say. I strongly believe they did. And I think part of that reason is because, so I was on a scholarship at a private school, but a lot of institutions have a reputation to protect. Stories that we hear time and time again tell us that the reputation is prioritised every time, almost every time, over assisting the child. And so any institution where they are running a business or whatever it might be that they're doing, especially a reputation that they are in some way better than others. So whether that's because they're a private school, you know, we've seen a lot lately about the Catholic Church and the Church of England. Politics is another one, we see it in politicians. Their existence is in a way premised on them being better, I'm going to say. That is protected at all costs and certainly protected at the expense of the child. I was at school in the kind of 2000s period. Well, I don't know what you call that decade. What do you call that? The noughties? So I was at school in the noughties. But to this day, I concluded the case against them last year. It was still the cover-up. So, yeah. So I'm not sure that how much it's really changing.
What happened with the case in the end?
They settled. So initially, the school denied everything. And then eventually, after years, and I really mean years, of campaigning for my own records, I got the press involved. I had to go through various different systems. I initially wrote to them saying, hi, what happened? I don't understand. I'm starting to have therapy. Like, what are your safeguarding policies now? The response I got back was, it incited so much anger in me that I started to take it further and further. I had to pay £600 to issue the claim form, which would not be open to everyone. It wouldn't be open to anyone, I don't think, without independent legal advice, which wasn't on offer. And eventually they settled out of court. But to this day, no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I have letters saying that they'd do the same again now. For me, any child seeking the morning after pill or a termination, I also had sexually transmitted diseases. They were aware of all of their actual knowledge, plus the actual disclosure, plus the actual text messages from their abuser, plus him coming into school. I was often raped in school premises. For them to say that that isn't enough it made me angry. I got angry.
Of course.
Yeah.
And it should have just been the case anyway that you were believed, regardless of that proof, but you even had it, and you're an experienced human rights lawyer.
And I think as well at the time that was so lonely, right? Like I had nowhere to go. No one believed me. I remember a nurse I had to have a surgical termination because it was discovered too late because, well, I had no idea that I was pregnant. I was very skinny anyway, and I don't think it always shows. So by the time I realised what was happening and was forced into having a termination, it had to be in a hospital through a surgical procedure. I remember the nurse saying, like, where's your mum? I feel strongly that there were so many steps along the way where someone could have intervened. And what upset me most about the school is that the text messages they had sight of and my asking for help came before the first rape. And so if they had intervened then, if they had gone then to social services, the grooming would still have happened, that abuse still would have happened, but it could have been stopped before what was then years of abuse. Yeah, diseases, pregnancy, awful things.
The absolute strength that it just takes to even get through that. And I'm not even just talking about to fight a school, to then also have to show up in that institution again after all that time.
Yeah. The reason it came about actually was I was having a private psychotherapy session, and my therapist said to me, where were all the grown-ups? I can't remember if he was saying it in the context of my parents or hospitals or schools, but it really got me thinking, like, yeah, there was no one. Like, where were they? And that's when I wrote to the school and said, what really happened? Because I almost was questioning myself. I was like, there must have been someone that I could go to. There was no one.
I remember when we talked about doing this episode, one of the things we were both concerned about is obviously it's been a while since we were children and there's a different environment now, but
yeah,
the fact that they're still writing saying that they would do these things again, like, it just makes me think, has anything changed? My school were not exactly the most welcoming place. I didn't have to go through anything you went through, thankfully. I had told one friend about this whole abuse thing, and I just was looking for a moment where I could plant that seed somewhere else, or almost like just crying out for someone to talk to. We had like this pastoral care office, and it was literally like where all the detentions were. It'd be where girls came to have fights about their attendance, and it was also where people came to collect stuff from the cloakroom. And then there was this like really grumpy older woman who was so unapproachable, and whose other role at school was to just tell you off about the length of your skirt.
Yeah.
And I just remember thinking, like hell, I'm gonna go up to you and be like, I need to have a word. Like, this is what's happened.
I mean, when I self-harmed, I was put in isolation. I was put in the sick bay wing in isolation for a week as punishment. And I did my work from in there because they didn't want me to, like, I don't know, frighten the other kids or... Yeah, and I think that is a common response, is to identify the child as a problem. The more vulnerable you are, the more vulnerable you are. So we know that children who are disabled, for example, are more likely to be abused. If you're in care, I think 4 times more likely to be abused. It might even be more than that. And abusers know that, and they look for children that are already the problem children. And that's even more reason that we should be supporting difficult kids even more.
I should probably flag that we both went through some form of court experience.
Buddy's unhappy about that.
Oh.
Yeah, the criminal justice system, well, not just the criminal justice system, there's also the civil justice system, but I think when people think about legal proceedings, they're often thinking about the criminal court. And I went through a criminal trial when I was 15 years old. You went through a criminal trial as well.
Yeah. I was a bit older though. I was 18. And I just tried to have as little to do with it as possible.
But mine was, in a Crown Court, I gave evidence over video link. It's a weird thing to say. I guess I was lucky in that I secured a conviction, which is very, very, very rare.
Oh, Buddy's angry at the legal system
He's
in the
really
UK.
angry, and I don't blame him. And that experience was awful, like deeply traumatic. And that was dealing with a case where it wasn't historical at the time. It was ended by the police. There was a wealth of medical evidence, there was text messages, and a lot of people don't have that. It's very deeply flawed. My main abuser was my mum's partner. So he was at least 30 years older than me and was going to be my stepdad. It was still prosecuted as a consensual relationship with a minor. Wow. It wasn't prosecuted as a rape. So I think the charges brought were indecent assault against a girl under 16, sexual intercourse with a girl under 16 and anal intercourse with a girl under 16. And I really remember the defence team arguing that I had seduced him because I was jealous of my mum. Like, this seductive child argument was still being used, and I was asked if I orgasmed with him. But even to this day, I'm like, was that really abuse? Was it abuse?
I actually wasn't in the courtroom for my abuser's conviction.
I wasn't in the courtroom for mine either.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Actually, I'd love to compare and contrast. My family told me that my abuser, but they didn't know at the time that he was my abuser. But when they said, oh, he's being investigated, I was like, I have to say something now, or that's my moment gone. And eventually built up the courage.
Discourage, yeah,
I like that. to tell them that weekend. I already knew it was gonna really break them, the family. I knew there was gonna be a lot of conversations and questions. And I think for me, it was just building up that initial rip the plaster off and tell them moment. My mum said, do you think you would be comfortable to tell this to the police? And she was very much of the mind of, I think you should, because this happened to you, and I think that form of justice should be reflected in the investigation. Whereas for me, and I feel differently about this now, but at the time I was very much like, do you know what? If that's what you think you need, like, I'm really happy to go for it. I wasn't too bothered, honestly, which way. And that was my entire response throughout the entire court case. It was like, I'll do what's the absolute literal bare minimum. I went and did my statement in a safe, I think this is called a safe house.
Yeah, same, yeah.
Where they like really sweetly but very tragically try and make it look like a home.
Oh yeah, and there's a lot of like teddy bears around. It's so not appropriate when you're a teenager. Yeah, been there. Cuddly toys.
And then wrote a victim personal statement and all of that kind of thing, but very much didn't want to be there in the courtroom. In fact, there was actually a lot of drama with that because we weren't told the date of the case until the morning of it happening, deliberately so that my mum couldn't come. The abuser doesn't live in our area, so she had to really drive. But again, I wanted nothing to do with that. I'd been brought up to think, at least from my school point of view, that like, if something's wrong, the police will protect you. Yeah. Oh my God. Just
and that's from the point of view for me as a white woman as well. Like, he was ingrained to believe that the police are there to help me. And imagine if you're from a community that is not your experience.
Yeah. My abuser ended up getting 18 months, I believe it was, for one crime against me that he should have got minimum 5 years. Yeah. Let alone the other 3 people that we know of that he abused. My abuser was white, went to a boarding school from a family who paid for a great defence lawyer. His lawyers rang my mum and said, if you drop XYZ charges about Sophia, we'll consider dropping XYZ charges and maybe he'll plead to this certain thing. And she was like, are you trying to blackmail me? Yeah. I very much recognise my privileges in this, in that I had a parent.
What an ironic statement, by the way, but carry on.
It's true. But it's true though, isn't it? Like, I recognise my privilege in that I had a family who were supporting me. My mum was doing all that paperwork and covering that side of it for me, so I didn't even have to think about it. We are 2 people who luckily got a conviction, which was so rare in itself. To think that even after all of that, your experiences of a child were painted in such a way to make it look like you were seductive.
That word was used a lot, and slut, and there was a lot of comment on the way I dressed. I mean, not that it matters how I dress, but my stepdad actually bought me a lot of the clothes in the first place. I think about this a lot because it was in a therapy that my therapist said to me, can you tell I love my therapist? Finally, I had a lot of bad ones, but that vulnerable is not the same as responsible. And I, when my abuser came into my life, was pretty vulnerable. He preferred me to my sister, which for me was I experienced that as a novelty. So that for me was really exciting. I was having a very, very difficult relationship with my dad after my parents got divorced. He told me I didn't have to see my dad anymore, that he would protect me. He helped me with my homework. He bought me my first ever CD. And so I felt a lot of warmth towards him. I was very excited by him. And so this argument of like being seductive was so corrosive to me because I wanted his attention. And then to have the fact that I wanted that attention weaponized against me, that I had brought all this on myself. I'm not over it now. Like, I don't think I'll ever get over that. I wanted his attention, and that is not the same as wanting to be abused. I was the person it happened to, and it took me so long to get my head around that it wasn't my fault. And then to hear it back from people in positions of power that it was soul destroying. And to this day, I feel if I get unwanted attention of any kind, I'll automatically assume it's because it was my fault. I smiled at them, or I liked them, and that stayed with me for life.
At least when I was first coming out was, oh, but that happened, and that happened in the past. Just forget about it now, close your book and move on. And I've literally had those words said to me so many times. It's so difficult to move on when you're so often reminded of the structures that failed you. So much so that I have actually found it arguably more difficult since disclosing than I did when I was keeping it to myself.
Yeah.
But obviously, when I was keeping it to myself, I was suffering. I was really unhappy.
Yeah.
But now I'm suffering and everyone knows about it and everyone around me is suffering too. But the feeling that I have now that I've just got it off my chest is, for me, worth it. But is a chance to now like almost push back and be really critical of those times institutions failed us.
Yeah, massively.
So to end on something positive, we want to move to a section now about so what. As someone who'd gone through the court and justice system, no one had even mentioned this to me, which really shocked you. But do you want to talk more about the compensation scheme? Yeah,
so, and actually this was something ICSA touched on. So at the moment, and this is for any type of crime, this isn't just sexual abuse, there is something called the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority. And it's a fund. It doesn't work like insurance or like clinical negligence. It's a fund set up for people who have been victims of crime to compensate them for arguably failures by the state. And you can make an application to that fund for compensation. You don't even need a successful prosecution for that. At least it was when I went through it, on a banding system. So you've got a disease, tick this amount, you've got this, tick this amount. So ICSA is saying that doesn't go far enough. It's not suitable for survivors. It doesn't acknowledge the lifelong impacts of this stuff, but it is there. And I went through it. You know, it's weird, and I don't know if my memory is failing me because there's a lot I don't remember. I didn't know that I was going through it. I think someone did it on my behalf. And then I got told about it, and I was just told about the money. And I think maybe that's because I was 15 at the time of the trial. And that money for me was a way to run away and escape. And it also supported me to go to uni and study law.
Just creds to you as well, isn't it?
Thank you. I will try and take that I will try and take it. Thank you. Thank you, Sophia. Yes, I am fabulous.
And if people wanted to know a bit more about this, what would they Google?
It's abbreviated to CICA, the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority. So I would look that up. I wish I knew more about it, but I was younger when I went through it. And it will be interesting to see if the recommendations in ICSA for dedicated kind of lifelong support will come through, and specific compensation. And there's also an idea in there that institutions will voluntarily contribute to this fund. So we'll see. But
hopefully, but...
yeah. There are certain services or compensations or charities out there. You have to fight so hard for them.
And you have to know about them.
You have to know about them.
What about any advice to protect yourself from institutions when disclosing?
For me, for example, when I was suing my school, and a lot of people tried to dissuade me from doing it with my best intentions. But the anger fired me on, and I needed to do it. And I'm so glad I stuck with it. I truly believe that deep down, people know what they need. They do know what they need, and maybe they've never had the chance to listen to that or to ask for it. And so it can be really, really hard. So if you're able to trust yourself, do.
Yeah. Looking back in my case, even if I was just a smidgen more prepared, that the institution I was talking to might not have my best interests at heart, I think I would have acted very differently. And that's not to say I wouldn't have disclosed. I still would have written my personal statement, my victim personal statement, which is a piece of paper about how your abuse has affected you, essentially. Like, I still would have written that exactly the same. I still would have disclosed exactly the same at the safe house.
Yeah.
But I would have just been aware of, like, don't expect to be updated on anything. You're going to have to find the energy to chase that if you want that information. You need to figure out what you want and ultimately how to ask for that, and be ready that you might not get that. And that, I don't want us to end on like that negative note, but even to just have people in your life that are aware of that and willing to take up that energy for you as well. I think that wraps it up for today. And you'll be happy to know. Thank you for listening. This is my one ask of this series, that you tell someone that you've listened to this conversation and use it as a seed to start conversations of your own, and you will be surprised what the feedback will be. It might not always be negative, it might not always be positive, but I think I can speak for both of us in saying that it's actually that practice of having these chats more regularly that has got us to sitting in these chairs right now. We're going to process.
And feed that dog.
Feed this dog, this poor support dog, poor buddy. And we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.
Bye.
If you want more bite-sized content, we also have a webisode version of this episode called The Secret's Out, which focuses on more do's and don'ts for your own conversation. Find us on YouTube or by going to www.secretsworthsharing.com.